Welcome to Nutanix Weekly, hosted by me, Phil Sellers, CTO here at XenTegra. This season, we're going deeper into hybrid and multi-cloud strategy, deeper into real-world use cases, and deeper into how Nutanix simplifies everything with one platform, one-click operations, and a smarter way to manage IT. Whether you're running on-prem, in the cloud, or somewhere in between, this is the place to understand what's changing and what to do next. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get to the episode.
Welcome back and welcome to another episode of XenTegra's Nutanix Weekly podcast. Our fearless leader, Philip Sellers, is off on an IT adventure today. So this week's going to be a little bit different as Chris Calhoun, Marcus Barton, and myself lead the conversation. Before we get going, let's do some quick introductions. Andy Greene, I'm a solutions architect here at XenTegra. I've been here for about coming up on a year and a half now. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Solutions architect as well. You and I both are in the modern data center practice, led by Philip Sellers. And I've got a couple of months ahead of Andy, but we are both focused on infrastructure, all things involved. Obviously, in this case, Nutanix. Our past history crosses paths with Nutanix, and we're looking to continue that conversation today. So, Marcus, you're next, buddy.
Hey, guys and gals. I'm Marcus Barton. I'm a senior systems engineer with Nutanix. Chris kind of mentioned it. I've been here for 7 years, and Chris and I used to work together on the same team. I worked with Philip and XenTegra on many different deals back when I lived in the Carolinas, but right now I live in Atlanta, Georgia. Long history career with Dell EMC and with Microsoft, but I finally have made it to the company that I live and love.
Well, let's go ahead and get going here. So today we are going to talk a little bit about a LinkedIn blog post, and this one's by Dwayne Lessner. It's titled, "The Agent Stops Writing the Script, It Becomes the Script. MCP Server is Coming." So this blog that we're unpacking today talks about something that might feel a little bit abstract at first. It's the idea that instead of writing scripts, we're going to start building agents. Those agents don't just run inside of our systems, they become part of the system itself. So I'll go ahead and kick things off here. So Dwayne writes, a few weeks back, he wrote about NCM 2.0 being the best Nutanix product because Claude Code could write the automation for him. That was step one. And then step two showed up at .next 2026, and it changes the map again. Chris, any idea why Dwayne thought that NCM was the biggest Nutanix product?
To me, I think and I've had customers in the past that focused on API interactions. It was previous versions of the Nutanix API, and it was a matter of trying to interact and get the right coding of, I'm calling a script, but I'm not sure if it's version 1 or version 2. And I think as we unpack this, you'll see that it's not about calling the scripts and trying to get information back. It's actually interacting with the infrastructure itself and being able to produce results quicker and more effectively. I think that's kind of part of the gist, and we'll see as we unpack the details from the article today.
Well, in the blog post, he writes that at .next 2026, Candida Deviani and Nitish Kuhn from the Prism and API team walked through the V4 API story. He says that buried in the back half of the session was the part that really matters for where this blog is going. They demoed an MCP server generated from the V4 Open API spec. They hooked it up to Cursor and they ran a prompt. And the prompt was simple. It says, associate the third category to that VM. So the agent pulled the category UUID from a previous response. It called the API through the MCP server, returned the task ID, and confirmed the association. So that is not Claude Code writing a Python script anymore. It's a completely different mode of work. Before we really get into that, MCP, I think, this is one that I had to do a little bit of research before the call. This is a standard way. It's short for Model Context Protocol, and it's a standard way for AI systems to connect to the tools and the data. So think of it like an API designed specifically for AI agents instead of human programmers. So instead of teaching every AI system how to use every different API differently, MCP gives them a common language. So when he says that it's a different mode of work, Marcus, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a different mode of work. If we think about what he was doing with Claude Code before, is he was having Claude write a script for him. And then he has to take, as we all know, AI can make mistakes. AI can hallucinate. And so you can't just have AI create code for you and then you just copy, paste that code. You have to kind of check it out a little bit first to make sure that it's error-free, that it actually works. I've had AI write PowerShell scripts for me before, and they just flat out just didn't work because of the context that they were using or the code that it was writing. So there's still some interaction that the person has to do to make sure that, hey, the code works before I run it. And then if you're going to implement it into any type of infrastructure, you're going to probably have some things that you're going to have to do before you actually run that code. And what this is doing, what MCP is doing, is it's switching. The agent isn't writing the script. The agent now is interacting directly with the platform, with the API via an MCP server bridge. And what it's doing is it's actually doing the task. What most people would probably define an agent as being what an agent is actually performing a task. And so the example that he gave with, we use categories in Nutanix to do all sorts of things, but we categorize VMs and whatnot to be able to apply policies to them. And that policy might be a security policy, it might be a replication policy, it might be a storage policy, whatever it is. We're going to use categories, sort of like tags in other platforms that most people are maybe familiar with. But what he's asking the MCP to do is to define that category or associate that category with a specific VM. And in order to do that with scripting, you could say, okay, AI, write me a script, whether it's Python or something else, to look up that category and actually apply that category to the VM. But instead, he's using conversation to tell the MCP to do that task. And so it doesn't have to go and spit out the actual code. You're having the agent actively interact with that platform API. And that's huge. It's enormous.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that, to me, what you said, Marcus, is really the point. It's natural language instead of a scripting language. You mentioned PowerShell. I'm an old PowerShell guy too. I taught myself the syntax, and that's the language that you had to learn. Many of those, we'll say, languages in the past, some had steep learning curves, but then now it's progressed to actually using our natural English language in basically saying, hey, I trust the model enough, because that was from our past podcast was, hey, you have to kind of trust this AI technology, but we have to trust a model enough to actually interact and have free reign of the system. And that's something that's called out there too. So you've got to be real careful in what you say in your language, because it'll actually execute exactly what you say. So I think that that's part of the interaction and the language that it's now recognizing.
Right.
Yeah, the blog goes on to talk about two different ways that we can use these tools, and one being tool calling, which is really for more of that exploratory, one-off, interactive. I want you to show me all of the powered off VMs in this cluster, or something along those lines, and then start turning certain VMs back on. Whereas code generation really wins when the work needs more control, peer review, or even repeatability. So I think he points out that NCM2 with Claude Code lives in that second mode. The agent helps to write the script, and then it becomes his job to review it. It becomes part of the automation library, and then MCP opens up the first mode. So the agent does the work directly, and the prompt is the only thing that really needs to be repeatable. The blog goes on to talk about why the V4 APIs were already headed there. Chris or Marcus, do one of you guys want to talk a little bit about why that is?
I'll jump in just from a history perspective, in that, like I said, in my days at Nutanix, I had a customer that I would say was actually on the bridge of the version 1, version 2 API integration, that they were looking to tie it in with some of their external communication and inventory system. And it was at the time where they had to decide, is this a version 1 versus a version 2 API? And I think that now, and Marcus, you can attest to this too and add more context, but version 4 is basically a ground up rebuild of the communication within the Nutanix platform. And that all started with a complete rewrite. It looks like it's mentioning that was done back in 2020. So this is all a solid communication platform where these agents are actually now communicating and talking with. And I think that solid foundation is where things are now built upon, and that's the strategy going forward.
Yeah, and to call out something else that he mentions there is that the reason that this is possible is because since 2020, they've been moving towards in the right direction, so to speak, and making the right kind of decisions. Because if you think about it, this V4 API that we're talking about, it reached GA when we released AOS 7.0. So it's not that the V4 API is not that old. And so these are all decisions that were made like way back when. And as we've progressed in the different versions, we've kind of continued down the correct path, the good path, if you will.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, Chris, when you were talking about, and maybe it was you, Chris, maybe it was Andy, that you talked about how you have to be careful. I think you mentioned that you have to be kind of careful with what it's doing because it could create some harm, if you will, because you're basically telling the MCP in language, in conversational language, do this task. And you want to make sure that it does that task and it doesn't go off the rails, if you will, because we know AI can make mistakes. It can hallucinate. And so how you kind of get around that with these MCPs is they're given very, very tight guidelines or guardrails of what they can do. And yes, there's probably some things that we need to do later on. I think the article also calls out like some of the things that needs to come down the road, whether it's audit trails and those kinds of things. But we are putting some guardrails around specifically what it can do, and that's all through role-based authentication to make sure that it can only do certain tasks on the cluster. We don't want to just be able to say, hey, go delete that cluster or go, destroy that cluster. We don't want it to be able to have that full reign cluster admin kind of capability. So there are some guardrails around the API key and RBAC that we give it. We don't allow it to just figure out what its intent is and then it go do it. We give it some defined guardrails on making sure that it doesn't do some damage to us.
That's a really great point, Marcus. I like to think that AI doesn't really have that capacity to turn evil, but it can cause damage, right? If through incorrect reasoning, you mentioned RBAC. I think that's a very important thing. Excessive permissions and also any type of autonomous execution. So, good security guidelines. We definitely want to focus on least privileged access, approval workflows, making sure we have appropriate guardrails in place, and making sure it's auditable. We don't want AI going out there and doing things on its own without at least somebody having some guardrails in place and some idea of what it's doing.
Right.
Yeah, and I think Dwayne makes the point that this is not Nutanix retrofitting agents into the legacy API. It's actually 6 years of architectural discipline showing up exactly when the industry needed. And I think that was a really salient point. When I read that, that just kind of made sense to me. If you think about it, I think one of the things that they're calling out here is there's a new way of writing software with agentic AI. If we think about the traditional methods, we might have a developer who writes a script or an application. That application follows a very fixed set of rules, right? APIs are called in a predefined order, and humans really decide exactly how everything works. With this newer model, instead of hard coding every step, we're going to give AI a goal, and it figures out which tools to use. It decides the order dynamically and it adapts while it's actually running. So a lot of implications around that. The blog goes on to talk a little bit about API keys, access keys tied to a service account. I think that really ties into what we were just talking about around least required privileges and making sure that we're constraining that access through RBAC and proper domain scoping. Chris, is there anything that you'd like to add there?
I think it definitely makes sense because the idea that you're moving through a script, and in the time of a script writer, you had to think through, okay, I need to process action 1. I need to process action 2. It was very serialized. But I think to the point that you guys are referencing, obviously, that this is, hey, we need to in natural language, tell the model that here's what we want to happen as an end state, and it figures out the process. So as long as those guardrails are in place, then the end result's going to be what we want. And I think that that's a shift between having to keep in your toolbox joined scripts or linked scripts that have to go through item by item to get to that end state. It's now about a combination of, okay, which model's the right fit and how do we get there in the most streamlined way with version control, peer reviews, audit trails, all of the stuff in the past that was needed in a more simplified way. You know, it's going back to Marcus and I mentioned PowerShell. The phrase in the past was, hey, if you repeat the process, it needs to be scripted. Well, now it's, hey, if you can interact with a model in one-offs, great. If it's a combination of that, then let's put some organization and structure to it. So I think that this lends itself to the right focus of an API model with a mix of coding and natural language. So I think that that's gives you the flexibility and freedom to not have to just immediately bring out your coding tool and start banging out keyboard commands. You can actually have that interactive conversation. So perfect timing for that in year 2026.
It's wise to point out that this isn't a Nutanix problem. It's a pattern that every platform with an MCP integration is going to have to land on. So the good news here is that Nutanix's v4 APIs, the IAM model was built for this before MCP was added as a use case. This brings with it the question, how does this work with NC2 and GC2? Marcus, any thoughts there?
Well, I think that with NC2 and GC2, it's definitely going to give you some capability of being able to spin up resources in those environments. I think it's when it comes to those v4 APIs, you can manage those environments the same as you would as if they were on-prem. So a lot of folks that haven't experienced NC2 when it comes to being an Azure or AWS, what they don't realize is it is basically our software running on bare metal in those environments. And so when it comes to how you manage it, you would use these agents using MCP the same way you would on-prem, with a few little caveats. For the most part, it's going to be the same as you do as on-prem. Single endpoints, the contracts you create, you have a single contract, you have all the same experience that you would have on-prem. GC2, it's just a little bit different because we have the connotation that environment's a little more in a bubble, if you will. But it doesn't mean that you can't use those MCP agents in there. It's just it's a little bit more of a boundary. And so as long as you have that running in those environments, you can definitely take advantage of them.
I'd like to add something to Marcus's remarks around that. And this is a history perspective, again, going back to my days as an admin, where we were looking to migrate workloads from on-prem to AWS and Azure. And as infrastructure virtualization guys, we were hardcore into this is our platform. We know exactly how to use it. But then the tooling changed. Speaking AWS natively, speaking Azure natively is a totally different change in the way that architecture is laid out, designed, your interactions, your permissions, and capabilities. So to me, having this language of, hey, look, there's one model to communicate with your on-premises environment or your hybrid cloud environment, whether it's Azure or AWS. You don't have to have those, we'll say, gurus or experienced guys that have that history of AWS native communication. Yes, the NC2 works with those AWS skills and offerings, but the interaction with Nutanix means that you've got one language and it's the v4 API. And that's really the key for the integration and the hybrid model that probably most customers are seeing nowadays, of knowing that we've got to be flexible. We've got to move fast and we've got to be agile. How do we do that? Well, it's not by learning a new coding environment. It's staying with the native integration built into Nutanix and using that no matter where your platform lands.
And with the exception of GC2, so since it's GovCloud, it's a little more tightly controlled. But to your point, Chris, it's all using the V4 API. So even though you're running on-prem as the same as you would in AWS and Azure on NC2, at least those GovClouds are have a few more walls around them to protect them. So they're air gapped, and so you have to do things a little bit differently in that. The good thing is that even as the article kind of points out, is that this MCP, the Model Context Protocol, our AI 6.2, it's all running off of Prism Central. So as long as you have Prism Central in GC2, which you're going to have if you're running us in GC, you're going to still be able to manage that cluster and use everything that you would typically want to use. It's just a little bit more walled. That's all. But yes, same V4 API that you see in GC2, that you see on-prem, that you see in AWS or Azure. Absolutely.
Good stuff. Well, Chris, Dwayne goes on to mention a few things that he's watching for. This is obviously emerging technology, but give us the highlights on some of the things that he's looking for.
Following along right there. Of course, one of the things is everybody's dabbling in getting their hands in there because they're eager to learn more. I think that you've got to make sure that the session that was demoed was obviously forward-looking, is what he talks about, is official spec-generated MCP servers, and then the scope around that, the supported scope. And I think that to Marcus's point is scoping out the role of an MCP server is critical to the understanding of the boundaries and guardrails that you had mentioned. I've caught myself realizing that I'm sitting here talking with guardrails. So making sure that those are in place, obviously, is in a security-minded infrastructure. You want to make sure that those environments are auditable. And that's a tough word to say, but, having those audit trails there so that it can document the actions that are taken, I think is really key. And as we've talked about before, is trying to limit any LLM hallucination, making sure that knowing that environments are messy, the guardrails in place will help with that, and making sure that we limit the scope of what they can do is really part of that, so that then it goes into rate limits and concurrency. Having those models, making sure that they interact but respect boundaries. I think that that's really a summation of what he's looking for, and saying that, hey, look, these are just things that I'm pointing out. None of those are blockers or anything like that. And I think that that's the key path forward, is honing and refinement. This is what I would say would be a version 1. And as we know, this is part of NCM 2.0. So each iteration in each version of Nutanix software gets better and better.
I'd completely agree. And that's one, I think of it as a two-pronged kind of approach. So the V4 API that we came out with, it does have the ability for you identify the machine identities, right? So you have those service accounts that are treated kind of like machines and those accounts have a unique API key rotation workflow and some real strictly defined permissions. So that's one aspect. The second is that we kind of have the concept of a blast radius control, and that blast radius,
there you go,
is really around what you use in that RBAC. What are you allowing that agent to do? So if an agent has a read-only key, then let's say you're using that for monitoring and looking at logs and those kind of things, then it's not going to be able to do any kind of deleting or killing off anything that you might not want to kill off. And then when we came out in February, when we came out with NAI 2.6, we also we brought out the AI gateway, which gives you that centralized point of being able to manage that enforcement of your policies and token-based rate limiting if you want to control bill shock and those kind of things. So both the V4 API along with NAI 2.6, and those coupled together gives you a lot of control on what you can allow and not allow. Those guardrails, as Chris put it.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, Dwayne closes things out by saying that NCM 2.0 made him say the words best Nutanix product because Claude Code took the friction out of writing automation. He goes on to say that the V4 API plus MCP takes the next layer of friction out by removing the script entirely from a meaningful subset of work. Curious to hear, Marcus, what's your key takeaway from this?
I agree with him. NCM 2.0 is definitely the next step. There's a whole lot of other stuff within NCM that makes it a really, really good release. But being able to utilize those agents using MCP is huge. Being able to say, like, if you wanted to automate the provisioning of NKP, go out and build, an instance of NKP and give it in real words, conversational language, and having it go out and determine which APIs and what tools it needs to use to do that, and then doing it is it's enormous. It's huge what we can get accomplished there.
How about you, Chris? What's your key takeaway?
To me, it's the foundation of Nutanix, in that Nutanix has always prided itself on doing technical or making technical things look easy. And I think that this shows exactly that case, in that the interactive models and the timing of this is such that, hey, look, I don't know what NKP looks like. Oh my gosh, I'm a new engineer. I've done VMs all my whole life. I've got to figure out this model. Well, no, you just have to interact with it. And I think that that's something that makes that learning curve easier. And again, the cloud hybrid model, I think that Nutanix does a good job of, again, being the platform of choice, allowing you to use the existing tooling. If you have a scripting background, great, interact with that as needed. But it also is allowing you to explore the capabilities of going forward of just natural interaction through common language, of getting that. Can you give me a quick inventory of the list of VMs that are powered off right now? I need to make sure that there's not any critical ones there. Well, say exactly what you need, and you get that as an output. So I think that interaction is, again, making Nutanix take difficult tasks and make them look simplified to those day-to-day administrators. And I think that that's a valuable tool going forward.
Well, I think the blog is really predicting that AI agents will evolve from assistants into more of a new computing layer. So we're going beyond just answering questions and instead evolving into an operating system for how enterprise computing might work in the future. So, what it's really saying is that we're moving from software that follows instructions to software that pursues goals. And that to me is an exciting use for all of this AI technology that we're all tracking. With that, I think that's a wrap. So really want to thank everybody for joining us on Nutanix Weekly, where we always want to break down the latest in all things Nutanix, hybrid, multi-cloud infrastructure, AI, and automation, so that you can stay ahead of what's coming next in enterprise IT.